guys. Today we're going to be reading in Luke chapter 6, verse 1 through 11. Before we get into it, though, I want to just briefly explain what Sabbath is, because it's going to have to do with this message quite a bit. Sabbath is, in its simplest form, basically taking one day of the week to rest and to worship God. It's something that God commanded in the Old Testament. The first Sabbath we ever see in the scriptures was God spoke the universe into existence over the course of 6 days, and then it says on the seventh day he stopped and he rested. And then the rest of history moved on from there. But that seventh day was one of rest. And so it's important to understand because we're talking today about Jesus being the Lord of the Sabbath. So Luke chapter 6, verse 1 through 11, it says this. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, "Why are you doing what's unlawful on the Sabbath?" Jesus answered them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and taking the consecrated bread, he ate what's lawful only for priests to eat." David wasn't a priest. He was the king eventually. It says he also gave some to his companions. Then Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." On another Sabbath, he went into the synagogue and he was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was shriveled. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. But Jesus knew what they were thinking, and he said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Get up, stand in front of everyone." So he got up and he stood there. Then Jesus said to them, "I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it?" He looked around at them all, and then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He did so, and his hand was completely restored. But they were furious, and they began to discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus. The Mark passage about this goes on further to say that they met with the Herodians with the plan to murder Jesus, to kill Jesus. They started to plot how they might kill him. The Pharisees basically followed Jesus around, hoping that he would trip up. They didn't like him. They saw him as opposition to what they were doing. They almost remind me of how reporters will constantly follow around a political figure, so they can report on what the person says, and then they feel this delight if suddenly the person misspeaks or some way trips up. Then it's immediately it goes out to every station. The president said this, or this congressman said this, and that's how I kind of think of the Pharisees sometimes, because they were always following Jesus and his disciples around, but they didn't like him. So on this Sabbath, again, they're following behind Jesus. They're counting their steps because you could only walk a certain amount each Sabbath. There's a set number of steps that you were allowed to take. So they're counting their own steps, and probably Jesus's, to make sure he doesn't break that rule. And they're hoping he's going to trip up in some way. And to their delight, the disciples begin to pick heads of grain, and they're rubbing them in their hands to get the outer shell off of the grain, and then they're eating it. And it's just to them a snack. They're not thinking anything about it. But these Pharisees, they pounce on this because they're looking for something where they can accuse Jesus of wrongdoing. And they, according to God in the Old Testament, we were told that the poor were allowed to eat kernels of grain from the fields. Some people, when they read this, they mistakenly think the Pharisees are upset because the disciples are stealing. But there's a verse in Deuteronomy 23:25 that says, "If you enter your neighbor's grain field, you may pick kernels with your hands, but you must not put a sickle to their standing grain." In other words, you can't go home with tons of arms load full of grain and just be piling it up in your barn. But it says you can eat some of the grain. So they were allowed to do this, but the problem was it's a Sabbath. And the Pharisees, according to their laws, it's against the law to rub the grain between your hands. Because when they would pick it off of the stalk, that's harvesting. in their mind. When they would rub it in their hands, that's like sifting or threshing. And then when they ate it, then through that process, they would say that they've prepared a meal. And they would say all of those things are work in a Pharisee's eyes. Harvesting is work, sifting and threshing are work, preparing a meal is work, and all of those are forbidden on the Sabbath, according to the Pharisees' laws. Now, that's not what God had commanded. The Pharisees, what God said was no work on the Sabbath. And then the Pharisees went way further than that, and they had like all of these rules in place. You can't do this, you can't do that, you can't move your chair in case it scratches the ground and moves some dirt, because that would be digging. Like literally the most insane rules, and this is one of them. And so they call out the disciples and they say to Jesus, why are you allowing them to do what's unlawful on the Sabbath? And I don't even think the disciples realized that they had done anything that could be considered wrong in this situation. My guess is they've done this since their childhood. This is probably something that, as kids, when they were going through grain fields, they were poor. They grew up in blue-collar families, and they'd go through and they'd eat the grain as a snack. They're not religious men inherently. They're fishermen and people like that. And so I don't think they even thought of anything of this. It reminds me almost of like a person who walks into a super conservative, proper church, and they're wearing tattered jeans and a t-shirt, and they might get some weird looks when they walk through the door of certain congregations. And they mean no disrespect whatsoever. They're not trying to like spit in the face of God or anything. It's just, this is what they wear, And in some churches, they have this kind of Pharisaic mindset where they would almost look down on people for that. And that's what it kind of reminds me of, is a person who has no ill intentions. Well, here's an example of something from my life that's kind of similar. I remember, so I was homeschooled all growing up, and I didn't actually go to a real school until middle school. And then I went to this Lutheran school, Holy Cross Lutheran, and I had this teacher named Mr. Albertine. And I remember that my first day ever going to that middle school, I didn't know what I was doing. I was so nervous going in. Like, no friends. Everyone not there felt like they knew each other. That's how it felt to me. And I asked my teacher something when I came into class. I don't even remember what it was anymore. It might have been something like, is there assigned seating in this class? Because I had learned from the previous class that that's sometimes a thing. So I walk in and I say, Mr. Albertine, is there assigned seating in this class? And he just ignores me. He doesn't say anything. He's sitting at his desk and he just ignores me. And so I think to myself, oh, he probably just didn't hear what I asked him. So I say again, louder, Mr. Albertine, is there assigned seating in this class? And again, he just ignores me. And so then by this point, the class has gotten kind of quiet and they're all looking at me and I feel kind of awkward. And so I just ask him again, kind of sheepishly this time, is there whatever? And this time his face begins to turn red and he gets really mad and he says, why do you think I'm not answering your question? And I had absolutely no idea. And he's like, and I said, I don't know. I'm not sure. And he goes, think about it real hard. Why wouldn't I be answering your question right now? And I said, I don't know. And he said, what's your name? And I said, my name is Josh. And he goes, Josh, the reason I'm not answering your question is because you are in a classroom and you raise your hand before you ask me a question. You don't just speak out of turn. And I remember I felt about this tall. I was so embarrassed and the kids in the room were looking at me like I was stupid. And I had grown up in a homeschool environment with my mom as my teacher and my brother as the one who's learning next to me. And I did not, we didn't raise our hand. I didn't know this was a rule in actual school until that year. And so I had no knowledge that this was a rule whatsoever. And I remember I just felt so embarrassed in that moment and ashamed, but I hadn't meant any disrespect by this. It's not like I was trying to be a rebel or I was trying to break the rules of the classroom. I just had never been taught this. And it wasn't the environment I had grown up in. That wasn't a rule I'd been taught, and I think that's what's happened to the disciples here. Is the Pharisees had way more rules than the disciples could keep up with, and this isn't one that they had learned yet. And so it's the Sabbath, and this is what they've always done. They begin to eat some grain, and they suddenly are called out, and I think they're probably feeling embarrassed and kind of small, because they're like, I didn't even know. Like, I'm not trying to spit in the face of God or break a law. I'm just, I thought I was just eating something. But I love the character of Jesus. Always love the character of Jesus, because Jesus immediately comes to their defense. Jesus doesn't say, well, it wasn't me. I don't know. Take it up with them. Instead, Jesus immediately jumps up to their defense, and he says, basically, in essence, he goes, you know what? It's up to me as to whether or not they're in trouble for breaking the Sabbath, because I am the Lord of the Sabbath. The thing that he ends with it is he says, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. And that was a phrase that Jesus used for himself all the time, because he's the Son of God and he's the Son of Man. And so then he goes on and he says, there's this guy in the Old Testament who broke a rule. Maybe you've heard of him. His name is David. And he broke a pretty big rule at that. And he goes on to tell him to briefly summarize the story. So I'm going to basically summarize it to you. In 1 Samuel 21, King David, it's before he's king, and he's on the run from King Saul, who's trying to kill him. And David's been on the run from him for a long time, and he's hungry and he's tired because he has every single day just been fleeing for his life with his men. And in his desperation, he comes into a town, and there's a priest there, and he asks the priest, is there any food that you can give to me and my troops so that we can renew our strength? And so the priest says, all we have is we have yesterday's consecrated bread. And here's the thing is, according to the law, according to God's law, only the priests were allowed to eat that bread. But he goes, we've replaced it, and this is the old bread, and there's the new bread in there, so you can have the old bread, the stale bread if you want. And David says, yeah, sure, give it to me. So he takes the bread, and he eats it, and then the men who are with him, they eat it as well. And I was reading this, and the question came into my head, and I'm not sure of the answer, but was what David did morally right? Is Jesus saying that David was in the right here? And the more that I thought about it, the more I just realized, I don't even know, honestly. Undoubtedly, he was breaking a command that God had given, that only priests were allowed to eat that bread. Even after it was taken off of, display, only the priests were allowed to have it. But I was thinking about it, and I was thinking there's kind of two sides in the story. There's King Saul, who's trying to do evil and to destroy a life. And then there's the future king, David, and he is generally a good guy, a man after God's own heart, and he's thinking of the welfare of his troops. And I was thinking, is it maybe that God spared him because he saw the desperateness of David's situation? He had mercy on him? Or did he see that David's motives were pure and that he was just trying to provide for his men? And the answer is, truthfully, I'm not sure which way it falls with this. But I'm not sure that Jesus actually was making that point here. I think that what Jesus was trying to say, it wasn't a statement on the morality of what David did, as much as he was making a point about the fact that the Father had understanding and mercy on David. It wasn't so much whether or not David was right in taking the bread. He might have even been wrong in this decision, because he was breaking a law. But God looked down from heaven and he forgave the offense, and David was spared. Jesus, who was in heaven at that time, he understood the unique circumstances that David was in, and he allowed this breach in the law in this one instance. And I believe that that's kind of the point that Jesus is making here, is God in heaven gets to choose whether or not you're punished for that, or whether God shows you mercy. And in David's case, he was shown mercy. Nothing happened to David as a result of him breaking this law. And I think Jesus is basically making this point. when David did that, I made the decision that that was okay. And now, with his disciples rubbing the grain in their hands and eating it and breaking the Sabbath according to the Pharisees, Jesus basically says, leave them alone. He goes, I created the day. You know, Jesus is literally the one who spoke the universe into existence over the course of those 6 days and decided on day 7, I'm going to rest. I'm not doing any work today. Jesus was the first one to ever take Sabbath. He came up with the idea of Sabbath. And so he can tweak the rules all he wants. And basically he says, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. And so it's not your concern, Pharisees, as to whether or not they're breaking it. Stop judging them. You know, I think that Jesus, well, we know that Jesus, he created morality, right? He's the one who even created the idea of right and wrong. And it doesn't exist apart from him. He's the giver, the standard of morality. He created the law. He can change the law if he wants, which he did at some point, which is why I can eat bacon. I had some yesterday. And so he created the law. He can change the law. He can throw out the law if he wants to. And Jesus tells us that in reality, he's the fulfillment of the law, meaning that everything that came before him, all of the law and the prophets, it pointed to Jesus. So he is center stage. He is the star of the show, the Lord of the Sabbath, the creator of morality. And he basically says, if the lawgiver and the judge says that you're innocent, there's no one left who can claim that you're guilty. If the creator of morality says that you're righteous, there's no one left who can claim otherwise. And so Jesus asks them this philosophical question. He says, which is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill? And here's the interesting thing that I feel like when I was reading this, I noticed this time, was that Jesus in this passage, so there's the next passage where it talks about the man with a shriveled up right hand, okay? And Jesus in this passage, he's restoring this man's life. He's doing a good thing on the Sabbath, right? But we're told in verse 11 that on this same Sabbath, the Pharisees become furious and they begin to discuss with one another how they might kill Jesus. And so Jesus is literally asking them this question, what's lawful to do on the Sabbath? To help this man to restore his life, to do good and to save life, or to do evil, which is what the Pharisees are doing, and that they are literally plotting to kill Jesus. And he says, which is better, to save life or to kill? I just thought that was so interesting because it's the two sides. Jesus is saving life, and they are literally plotting to destroy the life of Jesus. So he says, what is lawful? And I can tell you that in every single time in Scripture, if there's a law that God has instituted, it is always in the best interest of men. It's what preserves your life. It's what enriches your life. Even the law of the Sabbath. The reason that God created that law is because he said, it's better that you sometimes get to rest. The Israelites, they had been slaves in Egypt. And when they came out and Moses was giving the law, God said, and put one in there that says that one day a week you have to rest. You don't even have a choice. And what he's doing is he's enriching their lives. They had been under slavery. They had never had a day off in their lives. And Jesus says, from now on, one day out of 7, you're going to rest. And it was this wonderful law for their benefit. So the question of what is lawful is always going to be, of course, to do good, of course, to save life. It's to enrich your life. And this is something I want us to realize is when you know the rule maker, when you get to know Jesus, you better understand the rules that he made. Every single law in the scriptures reveals something about the character of God. It teaches us something about God's identity. And so it's really, if you ever want to do something interesting, start to just study the laws and think, what does this teach me about God? You know, why would he ask this of me? The Pharisees, they didn't like Jesus. And the reason was, as they got to know their God that they supposedly served, He was much more kind, caring, forgiving, and intimate with sinners than they thought that God should be. They thought God should be a little more standoffish, and he should come down a little harder on these disciples, because that's what they would do. And as they got to know the rule maker, they didn't really like him. But those of us who know our sinfulness and know how much we need a Savior, we fall in love with him so much the more that we learn why he's put his rules into place and what it teaches us about God's character. So the Lord gives us morality, and what we then do is we show love back to him through obedience. Jesus said in the Gospels, he said, "If you love me, you will obey my commands." And this is something that it's repeated several times in the scriptures, this idea that obedience is one of the ways that we show love to God. It's kind of God's love language, is us being obedient to him. Then he goes, "Then I know you care." When we lose our way, what we start to do, and it's what the Pharisees did, is we start to focus on this just checklist of like do's and don'ts. And it's not done out of any love for Christ himself. It's just, oh yeah, it's like a chore. It's like, yep, I got to do this today because that's what we do. The disciples, they had this sincere love for God where they were genuinely trying to please him daily, to the extent that they literally had given up everything they owned, become homeless, and they'd start to follow after him daily. And so these disciples, they were not in the wrong in Jesus's eyes. He's like, these are the men who have left everything to follow me. I am very pleased with them. Whereas the Pharisees, although they were doing the right thing by not breaking the Sabbath, they had boxed themselves into this daily routine where they would carefully keep away from anything that was overt and obvious law breaking. But their hearts had become cold and calloused. And long ago they had turned away from their God. And so there was no love there. It was just this checklist of don't do this and don't do this and don't do this, and then you're righteous. But Jesus says, no, if you love me, that's what should be the fuel that makes you obey my commands. So the Pharisees, they didn't live under the authority of God. They just lived in submission to their set of rules. They had lost connection with the head. Jesus is like a light that shines into the contents of each man's heart. And for some, like the Pharisees, it's filled with this filth and this selfishness and this pride. And if for that person, there's this discipline that needs to happen. And if they don't respond to discipline, then eventually punishment. But if Jesus looks into the hearts of like the disciples and hopefully me and you, and he sees that there's a genuine love for God and this repentance of our sins, then that man receives mercy and sanctification from the Lord. He goes, oh, I'll give you the mind of Christ. I'll make you more like me. And we begin to just really reflect the image of God in our daily lives. There's a verse that says, man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. And so there's this man with a shriveled hand, and Jesus says to him, get up, stand in front of everyone. And he asks them, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it? They don't respond. And so then he says to the man, stretch out your hand. And the Pharisees are furious because Jesus has done this good thing for this man, that he's healed him. And they're saying, oh, he's worked on the Sabbath. It's work to heal a man. But here's the ironic thing. Jesus didn't do anything other than speak. Like, I think it's really kind of interesting. You know, it's not like Jesus bent his hand. You know, maybe if Jesus had done any physical activity, they could have claimed it was work. But Jesus literally just spoke words. He said, stretch out your hand. And then the man, literally all he did was this. Nobody was working in this situation. There is nobody who is breaking the Sabbath even. Jesus spoke some words. A man separate from him moved his hands. That man couldn't have been healed if it wasn't God himself who was supplying the power for the healing. So nothing evil is happening here, and yet the Pharisees are just furious about this, and they go out and they say, all right, how are we going to kill him? It says they go to the Herodians, who don't even believe the same things as the Pharisees, because the Herodians want Jesus dead too. And they say, okay, we got to figure out how we're going to kill him. It's just like, how filthy are their hearts? How far are they from God? That this would be their response. And so when Jesus says, which is better, to do good or do evil, to save life or to destroy it, it's like, there's no question who's in the right here. There's two commands that are given in this passage, and both of them are given to the man with the shriveled hand. Stand up in front of everyone, and then he says, stretch out your hand. So Jesus is calling this man to an act of obedience. And when the man with the shriveled hand obeys Jesus' command, his life is restored to him. He finds healing and life in Jesus. And the thing that I really wanted to say about this is, every time that we act in obedience to Christ, it's no different for us. Imagine if this man with the shriveled hand had just been like, no, I'm not going to obey. Jesus says, stretch out your hand. And he's like, nah. Like, it would be the most ridiculous, like, that would be the worst possible thing he could do, right? Because he'd go through the rest of his life crippled and broken because he hadn't been obedient. But I want to say to you, it is no different for us when we ignore the commands of Christ. Every single command that Jesus gives for us, if we obey out of that love and that reverence, we find healing, we find restoration, we find life in him. It's living water flows from out of us. It's like we find the joy we've been looking for, the peace we've been looking for. Things start to fall into place in our lives. And so we would be so stupid if Jesus says, stretch out your hand, Josh. And I just say, no, I don't like that. I'm not doing that. Like, we need to learn this obedience to Christ because it's in our best interest. Because he's always going to do what benefits us most. And there's a psalm, if you ever want to study this further, read Psalm 119. It's a very long psalm. It's the longest chapter in the Bible. The entire thing is about how the psalmist who writes it, he loves studying God's law. And the reason is you bring out such good things as far as bring out wisdom for your life, but also when you learn to act in obedience to it, the blessing that comes into your life is profound, way beyond anything that you can imagine. And so in the same way that this man would be so stupid if he refused to stretch out his hand and he went crippled through the rest of his life, if you refuse to submit to Jesus' commands, you're crippling yourself. You don't receive the life and the healing and the restoration that is offered to you. So the takeaway here, I guess, is just that I want us to return to the source. I want us to return to Christ himself. I want you to really examine what's in my heart. Have I been just going through the motions of this checklist, chore list, like I've got to do these things, but it's not out of any kind of passion for the Lord? Or is it that we daily are saying, Lord, help me to be more like you, because we know that he is going to do this transformative work by his Spirit. Kelly had this piece of writing, and I want to end by reading this just because it was so on point with this. She wrote this, like, I think 5 years ago or something, and she read it to me today, and I just was like, wow, that's so good. So I want to read this to you. It's based on Deuteronomy 5:15, where it's talking about Sabbath, again, Sabbath, and it's talking about how God brought the Israelites out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, okay? And so there's parallels here, and I want you to listen to her writing. So here's the verse. It says, "Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day." And she wrote, in this passage, the Pharisees are waiting to see if Jesus will heal on the Sabbath. She's talking about the Luke passage. In it, the Pharisees are waiting to see if Jesus will heal on the Sabbath, hoping to trap this prophet into defying God. Well, what the Pharisees didn't understand was that Jesus was the Son of God, and he has the authority to heal and to forgive sins. So Jesus reminds the people where the authority of the law comes from. He tells the man with the shriveled hand to stretch out his arm, and he heals him, showing God's mighty and outstretched hand. through the healing of this man. With the Israelites, God showed his glory in pillars of fire, in plagues, and in miraculous wonders. Jesus, on the other hand, he expands our view of God's glory. He shows that the strength of God comes through our weaknesses at times. While God saved the Israelites with his own mighty hand and outstretched arm, Jesus tells a common man to stretch out his own arm, shriveled and weak. This man's weakness is then restored to strength, and oh, how God's glory shone in that weakness. So if you want to shine as a light for God, it's not about doing everything perfect or never once breaking a law. If the man's hand had not been shriveled and weak, Jesus wouldn't have been able to show his glory through this man. It's good to obey the laws of God, but we must remember the authority behind them first and foremost. Why do we do what we do? Is it because it's the law? Is it because we want our gold stars? Or maybe you don't even know why you're a Christian anymore. But Jesus knows. He shows us through his life that it's for him. That it's for the Father who frees us, the Father who is holy, and the Father who is worthy. There is no greater cause than this. So, I don't know, I just felt like that was so on point with this message. So I hope that as you listened, the Holy Spirit was speaking something to you. If there's any questions you have or any comments, go ahead and leave them in the space below. We're just excited to see you. Next week is the 17th, and that's when we're planning to officially begin our services again. And so we hope that some of you guys can make it out, and we'll be looking forward to it. All right, love you guys.